right. In 2020, the federal government banned 1,500 different firearms. Some of these were regular hunting rifles and sporting rifles that sometimes had carbonite stocks on them that made them look scary. Also on the list were items that I had assumed were legal, like German Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets and Russian anti-aircraft missiles. I suppose I missed out while I could. More recently, the federal government has promised to ban the sale, gifting, or transfer of all handguns in Canada. What would you do as Premier to defend the right of firearms owners from the federal government?
Yeah, I began by talking about this and the role that we can play with our Chief Firearms Officer. One of the things that she mentioned is that we already do the regulation on our shops that sell guns. And we also do sort of the higher order of gun licensing for those who need to have a second check. But most of our routine firearms licenses, they get processed in Mirror Machine. And it's taking not just months, it's taking years to do. I think the federal government is trying to encourage people not to get firearms. If we repatriate that act and we end up doing all of the administration here, it gives us more control over making sure that people who are law-abiding get their firearms. And then when we have an Alberta Provincial Police and the federal government says that they're going to start confiscating firearms, we can say, actually, we have different policing priorities. Our policing priorities is to make sure that those who live in rural communities do not have people going onto their property and stealing their stuff without it being taken care of. That's what our policing priority should be, but we can only do that if we take control.
Mr. Toews, while you served in cabinet, your government was the first in Canada to appoint its own Chief Firearms Officer. What further steps would you take as Premier to defend the right of firearms owners if you are Premier?
Yeah, number one, we need to work with other like-minded provinces to push back on egregious federal laws and restrictions that limit the freedom of law-abiding gun owners right across the country. Look, we did appoint a CFO, and I was at a gun range here in Calgary a few months ago, and that owner brought out automatics that day. We shot automatics in a gun range. I said, how can you do that? He said, you know what? Alberta, with our own CFO, grants us exemptions to do this legally. We benefited. I benefited that day from additional freedom for firearms owners. I would absolutely repatriate the licensing function, the transfer function, that administrative function needs to be conducted here in Alberta. We can do it. It's within our purview, and we will then create and set a course for firearms owners in Alberta to transfer, buy, and sell guns legally and more expeditiously.
I've had a restricted license for 35 years. I'm an avid hunter. I know that firearms are extremely important, and so is safety. And the balance, of course, is Section 91 and 92. I keep coming back to it because in order to do what we want, we have to open up the Constitution. Section 91, of course, deals with safety of the public. Section 92, of course, deals with personal property. What we need to do is pass a personal property law that deals with this particular item, ownership, in order to get the Supreme Court to make a decision on it. If we don't do that, if we don't open the Constitution, we're going to keep coming back to the same thing over and over and over again. In fact, what I would say to you right now is this, is that we can do that and we can pass it and we can get the Supreme Court of Canada to decide where safety is and where personal property is. But more than that, during that process, we have to make sure that the Chief Firearms Officer slows everything down. And I don't usually suggest that's the way to do it, but Mr. Toews is right. We need to slow it down, take over the administrative process, and just stop the federal government coming in. Thank you.
In 2018, 𝐂𝐂𝐿𝐿 rancher 𝐿𝐷𝐼 Maurice was charged by the RCMP for shooting and wounding Ryan Watson, who was stealing from his property. After massive legal bills and public outrage, the case against Mr. Maurice was eventually dismissed. Nearly 2 years later, Ryan Watson actually sued 𝐿𝐷𝐼 Maurice, although that court action eventually failed. In fact, I believe Mr. Maurice is actually here today. Stand up, 𝐿𝐷𝐼, if you're here. Where is he? Ryan Watson was later charged with possession of stolen property, possession of drugs, failure to attend court, and just 2 months ago was charged again in Strathmore with breaking and entry, theft, and a number of other crimes. But in 2018, it was Mr. Maurice who was deemed by the RCMP to be the real criminal and faced by far the most severe legal charges. What would you do as Premier to protect the right of self-defense and to shield people like Mr. Maurice from prosecution?
Thanks for the question. Well, first of all, there is the opportunity for self-defense. Now it's in the criminal code, which is governed, of course, by the federal government, and they decide what goes in that criminal code. I spent 3 years on the Justice Committee, so I did have some opportunity to see what happens. And I will tell you what really bothers me here is that he had to do that in the first place. If we had enough police officers in rural Alberta, he wouldn't have had to. And now we're talking with other people on the stage and other people that are in this leadership race about getting rid of the RCMP in rural Alberta. 71 communities don't want to get rid of it. Why are we not listening to them, folks? We don't have enough police officers now. We can have a hybrid model. We can have provincial police, we can have city police, which we have now, and we can have the RCMP and more officers on the street. But what we also need to do as a province is make sure that when our RCMPs actually find somebody, they can pursue them. Right now, we have a mandate from the provincial government saying no pursuit. No pursuit. Can you believe no pursuit? I think it's crazy. Go get them, guys. That's what I would do.
Ms. Smith.
Okay, I think ultimately because the Crown dropped the charges, that shows us that they didn't think they'd be able to get a conviction. That says to me that in Alberta, we have a cultural difference that they might have than what they might have in urban Toronto. And as a result, we do our policing a bit differently and we do our prosecutions a bit differently. I regret that that Eddie had to go through that because I think they could have stalled that out. They could have looked at the circumstances and chosen not to prosecute rather than put him through the circumstance that he did. But the bigger issue is why do we not have an effective RCMP police response? And I have RCMP in my community. I told you about the gun grab. I didn't tell you that they also closed my detachment down at 10 o'clock at night. So when Raj and Bob have their store shoplifted, it takes a neighbor to sit on the chest of somebody until the 𝐂𝐿𝐿𝐿 detachment sends somebody in. We are not getting good service in rural Alberta. You may not feel that way in Calgary, but I can tell you that we have to do a better job, and I believe in Alberta Provincial Police will do it. It's why we need to bring them in.
Sure, I do think the question is linked a little bit. Answers are linked. I recall back in the day when Mr. Maurice was basically cleared of any criminal activity. That was a good day for Albertans, but Eddie shouldn't have had to have gone through all of that. He shouldn't have had to gone through all of that to defend his property. Right now in Alberta, rural crime is an issue, and it's a complicated issue, but it's an issue. And that's why I believe it does intersect with an Alberta Police Service. I'm on record as supporting an Alberta Police Service for the very reasons that the RCMP, I believe, have a culture of risk aversion that undermines enforcement in rural Alberta. There's also a shroud of bureaucracy within the RCMP that undermines enforcement in rural Alberta. I believe an Alberta Police Service, a service that answers to Albertans, will be more effective at reducing rural crime.